Justin Trudeau, Canada, India, what is going on? So this Monday, we in India were minding our own business, doing our work when this news broke out, this stunning news broke out that the government of Canada has accused the government of India of possibly, potentially, perhaps, allegedly being having some tenuous links with the possible assassination of a Canadian citizen, of an alleged Canadian citizen of Indian origin. And the government of Canada then went ahead and expelled an Indian diplomat from Canada for this matter. And then India retaliated, responded in kind, and expelled a Canadian diplomat from India. And there's a lot of anger in India right now. So what is the deal? Are India and Canada enemies now? Does India hate Canada now? Do the people of India hate the people of Canada? Well, it's not quite the case. There is definitely a lot of anger right now, but the anger is reserved, is directed at Justin Trudeau and his government. I think Canada is a wonderful country, a very nice country. If you come across a person with a North American accent who is a really nice person, the chances are very high that that person is going to be a Canadian citizen as opposed to So yeah, there is a lot of anger right now, but it's directed at Justin Trudeau and his government. So let's understand what's happening. Let's examine the matter from an Indian perspective for a change. So let's examine, first of all, chronologically what happened. This Monday, this news broke out. The Canadian government, Justin Trudeau said in Parliament, in Canada's Parliament, that India is allegedly, potentially, possibly behind this assassination. And then Melanie Joly, one of the senior ministers, went ahead and announced that her government has expelled an Indian diplomat. So the Indian government then issued a statement calling these charges absurd and motivated, and India summoned the Canadian High Commissioner. That summons lasted only 4 or 5 minutes, and he was then sent back. And India announced that India had expelled a senior Canadian diplomat, possibly an intelligence operative of some kind. And then Justin Trudeau issued a statement saying that he is not trying to provoke India or escalate the matter. He just wants India to take these allegations seriously and all that. And then Canada further escalated the matter by issuing a travel advisory to Canadian citizens who would want to travel to India. And then India went ahead and issued a travel advisory of its own. Then India's National Intelligence Agency put out a list of more than 40 criminals and terrorists, many of them who have links with Khalistanis and Khalistani supporters in Canada. Many of them are possibly in Canada themselves. So that's the kind of escalation ladder that has been climbed by both the governments over this past week, and this is a process that's continuing. So that's what's happening. Suddenly, everything has gone bad. The relations between the two nations have possibly hit their lowest point, but there's a long history behind this. So let's understand the history behind this. And to understand that, we have to understand what this Khalistan movement is. So this Khalistan movement is something that has absolutely no support in India. It is from the perspective of the West and other nations. It's something that's linked with the Sikh people, but I assure you that it has no support whatsoever in India. It is a fake, fictitious, astroturfed movement for a fictitious separate nation called Khalistan, for a fictitious nation that would be carved out of the Indian Punjab region and other regions as well. That's what that Khalistani dream is. Now, this movement was created by Pakistan in the late 70s and the 1980s. It kind of devastated the Indian state of Punjab for about a decade in the 1980s. And it was created by Pakistan. Pakistan trained terrorists on Pakistani soil and pushed them across the border into India. It gave them arms and ammunition and training and support and safe havens and all that. And at that time, there was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan that was ongoing, and Pakistan was the linchpin of the US counter-offensive against the Soviet invaders of Afghanistan. So Pakistan was receiving a lot of US money, and some of that was being used, maybe a significant portion of that was being used to fund the Khalistan movement. And obviously the Americans knew about this, and this had their blessing. So essentially, the US financed Pakistani terrorism in India, in Punjab and in Kashmir from the 1970s, 1980s onwards until, well, some part of the 21st century. Let's say it that. Let's put it that way. And we'll not go into the U.S. angle right now because that's a whole different story. So this Khalistan movement was a Pakistani creation. And it was eventually brought under control, and the state of Punjab went back to normalcy. And it's been doing quite well. It's been quite prosperous. There's a lot of farming that happens there and so on. But many of these Khalistan supporters and terrorists, also terrorists, they fled from India in the 1980s. Many of them in the 1980s, some of them in the 1990s as well. And they found safe havens in what we call the Five Eyes nations: the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK, but mainly in Canada for some reason. So it's interesting that most of them went and settled in the Five Eyes nations, mainly Canada. So there's this racket in Canada. If you are an Indian citizen, if you're an Indian person, mainly typically it's Punjabis who do this, and if you are Indian, you want to migrate to Canada and you want to get residency over there, then all you have to do is you have to portray yourself as an oppressed minority or somebody who is under political oppression. India apparently is a very evil country that oppresses its minorities and oppresses people politically. So you have to portray yourself like this, and then it's very easy for you to immigrate to Canada and get refugee status and eventually become a citizen. So that's something that's been going on since the 1980s. And so that's why Canada and also the UK and Australia as well, and to some extent New Zealand as well, these nations have become hotbeds of anti-India activities and hotbeds of these Khalistani activists and supporters and even some terrorists as well who are wanted in India. So and these Khalistanis. So once you come to Canada and you have portrayed yourself as an oppressed, as someone who has been oppressed by India, you're going to keep up that facade. So that's why these activities, have been proliferating in Canada. So these people are very well networked, they're very well organized, they're well funded. So they are essentially a great vote bank. And that's why they are so influential in Canadian politics. So if you're a Canadian politician, it always helps to keep these Khalistani supporters on your, to be on their good side. That way you guaranteed a certain number of votes in your constituency. So that's why this Khalistani movement has become very influential in Canadian politics. Now, in the 1980s, it was known that many Khalistani terrorists had been given shelter in Canada. And in 1982, I believe, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi asked the then Prime Minister of Canada, Pierre Trudeau, Justin's father, to extradite a certain Khalistani terrorist to India. And the Trudeau government refused to do that. And 3 years later, in 1985, the same person, the same terrorist, along with others, was involved in the bombing of the Air India flight, the Kanishka flight in 1985, in which over 200 Canadian citizens died and over 300 people in total died. And yet Canada learned nothing from this, and the same policies continued of appeasing the terrorists, sheltering terrorists, and sheltering anti-India actors and all that, giving safe havens to criminals and gangsters and terrorists and anti-India actors. So Canada kind of became a different kind of Pakistan. It was very similar to Pakistan or Turkey, a nation that supports terrorism and gives shelter to terrorists and funds terrorists. That's the kind of nation Canada became because of its politicians, because of their petty personal political compulsions. That's what happened. So that's the kind of background that we have now. Now, who is this individual who was assassinated, allegedly, as claimed by the Canadians, by India? So, first of all, there's no evidence whatsoever. If they claim that Hardeep Singh Nijjar may have been possibly assassinated, who knows, by India, well, please provide the evidence. Where is the evidence? I have seen no evidence whatsoever. If they have the evidence and if they are so certain of this, why don't they produce the evidence? Well, the fact is that India does not do such things. India does not assassinate people outside its or within its territory either, right? Like, for example, you have the nation of Israel, and their spy agency is called Mossad. It's colloquially called the Mossad, and they are known to target and assassinate enemies of Israel across the world. Then you have the US, which flattens entire nations if they suspect that they are doing anything that is anti-US. So India is not like these nations. India does not do such things. Look at India's track record over the past seven decades. India does not do that. So if they have any evidence, well, why don't they produce the evidence? Okay, now let's talk about this individual, Hardeep Singh Nijjar. So this guy was a wanted criminal and terrorist in India. He was wanted for a number of criminal cases and terrorist activities. He apparently first came to Canada in 1997 on a forged passport, a fake identity, and he applied for refugee status, which was denied because he had a forged passport. Then 11 days later, he married a Canadian woman who sponsored his immigration to Canada, and because this was a marriage of convenience, it was again denied. His immigration was denied. And yet he was not deported from Canada. He stayed on in Canada, and he identified apparently as a Canadian citizen. And Justin Trudeau on Monday referred to him as a Canadian citizen. But there's no evidence he ever got Canadian citizenship. And then the Canadian Minister for Immigration tweeted that this individual became a Canadian citizen in 2015. Well, it's kind of strange that Interpol put out a red corner notice for this guy, Hardeep Singh Nijjar, 1 year later in 2016, in which his nationality is stated as Indian. So either the Trudeau government and their Minister of Immigration is lying, or Interpol is lying. Well, Interpol doesn't quite have a reputation or a track record of lying about these matters. So I kind of tend to believe that it's Trudeau and his government and his minister who have been lying about this. I don't think this individual ever became a Canadian citizen. He was a wanted criminal, a wanted terrorist in India, and he was sheltered by the government of Canada. Just the same way the Pakistanis shelter terrorists on their soil, the same way, right? And the government of India had requested the Trudeau government to extradite this person, but the Justin Trudeau government, not the Pierre Trudeau, and just like his father, he refused to extradite this terrorist back to India to face justice for his actions. So Trudeau behaved just like his father. So Trudeau is so let's examine Trudeau's history with India, and it's not a very pretty history. So in 2018, Justin Trudeau came to India on a long vacation kind of thing. He spent at least a month, I think, roughly a month in India with his entire family. They went touring around India, and eventually he met the Prime Minister of India at the fag end of the tour. The reception that he got was very polite and very correct, but it wasn't the warmest reception, right? Then in 2020, Justin Trudeau supported the farmer protests in India. So India had come up with this new legislation about which was called the farm laws, and a very small, tiny percentage of the farmer population of India protested against this. And these were mainly Sikhs in Punjab, okay, mainly Punjabis. And this guy, Trudeau, went ahead and supported these farmer protests. Here is the head of a nation who is openly interfering in the internal affairs of another sovereign nation. That's what he did. He blatantly, openly interfered in the internal affairs of India. He had no business doing it. So once again, that did not make him a lot of friends in India, whether it's the Indian population, the Indian public, or the government of India. So he supported these farmer protests. He said that I believe in free speech and human rights and freedom of expression and blah, blah, blah. But the same guy, Justin Trudeau, cracked down heavily on the same kind of protests within his own country. Protests against his horribly heavy-handed policies during the coronavirus outbreak. So you had people protesting against his policies, and he had horses stamp on wheelchair-bound protesters. He froze the bank accounts of truckers in an egregious violation of the most basic fundamental human rights, right? He imposed an emergency in Canada the same way his own father had imposed an emergency, I think, in 1969 in Canada. So both father and son imposed emergencies in Canada. And there was no need for an emergency, but he did that. So when it comes to other nations, he espouses human rights and democracy and freedom of expression, freedom of speech, liberal values, all that, unicorns and rainbows. When it comes to his own country, he has a very fascist authoritarian approach. His playbook is the same as that of Joseph Stalin or any other dictator. So that's the kind of guy he is, a complete hypocrite. Now, now let's fast forward to 2023. Just less than a couple of weeks ago, you had the G20 summit in New Delhi, which he attended. Justin Trudeau. He came with his son, obviously at taxpayer expense, right? I mean, most likely at taxpayer expense. I mean, what was the need to bring his 15-year-old son on a working visit? That too for possibly the most important global summit, the G20 summit. Well, he came with his son, and he did not get a great reception. He got a very cold reception from not just from Prime Minister Modi of India, but all world leaders. No one wanted to speak with him. Nobody wanted to speak with him, and it's kind of funny that he in last year's G20 summit in Bali, he got a dressing down from President Xi Jinping of China. He got a scolding from President Xi Jinping of China for breaching very basic diplomatic etiquette. Right, this year he got a scolding from President Biden, apparently. If you look at the photograph, it looks like Biden is scolding Justin Trudeau. And I'll tell you why this happened. And then he tried to get a bilateral meeting with Prime Minister Modi. It did not happen. Eventually, Mr. Modi pulled him aside for a very brief meeting in which Justin Trudeau tried to raise this issue of this Canadian Hardeep signature being allegedly assassinated by India. But Prime Minister Modi obviously turned the tables on him and brought out the fact that Canada harbors terrorists and anti-India actors, and Canada has been supporting such activities for decades, and Canada has no issue with Indian diplomats being with Khalistani sympathizers and supporters putting out public kill lists of Indian diplomats. He is okay with that. He has no issue with Khalistani sympathizers targeting Hindus and essentially giving out calls for the genocide of Hindus in Canada. He's okay with that. He has no issue with Hindu temples being targeted, vandalized, desecrated. No issue with that. His government is able to identify none of the perpetrators of these things, right? He has no issue with Khalistanis openly glorifying the assassination of former Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. Yeah, this happened recently. He has no issue with that. So, and he has no issue with Indian diplomatic properties being set on fire in Canada. His government isn't able to identify the perpetrators of any of these things, but they are able to somehow identify allegedly that India is behind the killing of this one Khalistani terrorist. So Prime Minister Modi, gave him a nice scolding. And if you look at the tweet that Trudeau put out in the picture of the two leaders, Trudeau looks like an errant schoolboy who has been summoned by the principal and who has been given a nasty scolding. That's what it looks like. So that is what happened in the G20 meeting. Trudeau was kind of shunned by everyone. He apparently tried to raise this issue of this alleged Indian hand in this assassination. He tried to raise this issue with the Five Eyes leaders, which is the leaders of the the leaders of the US, Australia, the UK, and New Zealand. Everyone rebuffed him. Nobody wanted to be involved in that. He even apparently tried to raise this with President Macron of France. Once again, he was rebuffed, and he ended up skipping the G20 official dinner that was hosted by the President of India. So, and he was mocked mercilessly even by his own media for the reception that he got in India. So that's the background, and then he comes back to Canada and then launches this bombshell. So why did he do this? First of all, he's a hypocrite. He has a problem with India. I mean, there's no proof, but if India hypothetically did this, it's no different from the US assassinating Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. It's no different from the US being behind the assassination of Ayman al-Zawahiri, which Trudeau applauded, by the way, in a tweet. It is no different between there's no difference between this and the US assassinating Anwar al-Awlaki and his son, both US citizens in Yemen, right? And Trudeau And there's another issue. There's another matter that happened in 2020, the assassination of Karima Baloch, a Baloch freedom fighter who obviously, most likely, was assassinated by the Pakistanis on Canadian soil. And Trudeau hasn't been able to find any link between Karima Baloch's assassination and the Pakistan government, when it's clear that the Pakistanis are behind this. But he has somehow uncovered an alleged link between the assassination of this Niger guy and the Indian government. So that's the kind of absolute farce that this guy has indulged in. But the question is, why has Justin Trudeau done this? So things aren't well in Canada. There's this big housing crisis in Canada. Inflation is rising. Joblessness is rising. There's this jobs crisis. Trudeau's ratings have dropped to record lows. He's being mocked by his media. He's extremely unpopular in Canada. So maybe he thought that, let me do this. Let me try to paint India as the bad guy. Let's put all the blame on India for everything that's going bad. That way, I look strong. That I'm taking on one of the major nations in the world, one of the major geopolitical powers, and this will also buy me a lot of goodwill among my Khalistani vote bank. So that possibly is the motivation, but that he is essentially sacrificing his nation's interests at the altar of his own political ambitions and compulsion. Because it makes a whole lot of sense for Canada and India to be friends. Both nations are democracies. Both nations have shared values. Both nations are huge nations, large nations. Both are large markets. Canada has lots of resources, natural resources, things that it exports. India needs that. India is a big market for other stuff that Canada can export. India is the only nation in Asia that can withstand China and counterbalance China. It makes a whole lot of sense for Canada from so many different perspectives to be friends with India, to be an ally of India. And as India grows, Canada can also prosper and benefit from trade with India and all that. But no, he doesn't want that. He is completely okay with sacrificing his nation's interests, his people's interests, at the altar of his own personal petty ego, petty political ambition, petty political compulsions. So that is what he has done. And that's possibly why he's doing this. But who benefits from this? Clearly, Canada doesn't benefit from this. The people of Canada don't benefit from this. They actually stand to lose a lot. Who benefits? Does the US benefit from this? Well, the US is a nation that is increasingly prioritizing its ties with India because we are in this new phase, this new multipolar phase. We are in the beginning of a new Cold War, a Cold War which has two sides. On the one hand, you have the West, the US-led West. On the other side, you have Russia and China and the nations that they are trying to bring together on their side. We are witnessing the beginnings of this new Cold War. And China is a big guy on the other side. And India is a nation that is friendly with almost everybody. India has equally good relations with Russia as well as the US and Canada, until now, and other nations. India has excellent relations with the global South. India was recently instrumental in bringing the African Union into the G20, which is now the G21. So India has all-round good relations. India is not an expansionist power. India is not an imperialist power. India is not a hegemonic power. India doesn't threaten other nations the way China does. India doesn't spring debt traps on other nations the way China does. So India is the good guy here. India is a non-threatening major power, and India is a rising geopolitical power. In 2 to 3 years, India will be the third largest economy in the world. And the US understands this. The US wants to prioritize its ties with India, and it wants to use India as a counterweight to China. The only nation in Asia that can counterbalance China is India. And in the next 20 years, India is going to be a genuinely great power in Asia. So the US wants India on its side. And by doing this, by playing this trick, by doing what he has done, Justin Trudeau is jeopardizing that. Because to many people in the West who are not aware of these geopolitical complexities, it may look like India is the bad guy here because of the way Justin Trudeau and his government have portrayed India. And that could drive a wedge among various political factions in the Western countries and all that, and that could kind of jeopardize what the US and what the West and also what India are trying to achieve together. So Canada stands to lose a lot from what Justin Trudeau has done, from this stunt that he has pulled. The US and the West stand to lose a lot from what he has done. Who stands to gain from this? Well, clearly it's China that stands to gain from this. And isn't that surprising? Well, it is alleged that Canada, that Justin Trudeau may possibly allegedly be a Chinese asset. Well, recently Trudeau was perfectly okay with the Chinese government threatening Canadian citizens, even a Canadian MP, because he belonged to an opposition political party. A political party that was in opposition to Trudeau's party. Trudeau was okay with that. And he may have deeper China links than what we may know or believe. So it is certainly within the realm of possibility that Trudeau might have gone rogue and maybe doing this at the behest of China. We all know that he was scolded by Xi Jinping. So what? So what? He has an ego, but the ego is reserved for certain things. He also is pretty malleable and open to various things. So Trudeau isn't serving his nation. By pulling this stunt, Trudeau has done his nation and his people a great disservice. And he has, whether he realizes or not, whether it's overtly or covertly, whether it is by omission or by commission, he is helping China out. So what happens now? What does India do? Well, India can ratchet up, can take this higher and higher up the escalation ladder. India doesn't. I mean, if there is no Canadian ambassador in India, it doesn't really hurt India's. It doesn't make any difference to India. India and Canada, the trade is very negligible. What's the worst that Canada can do? It can impose sanctions, nominal sanctions on India. Well, India can impose the same sanctions on Canada and stop trading with Canada and block Canadian goods and supplies to India. We don't care. We'll get it from somebody else. Nobody else will participate in such absurd sanctions against India. So that's the worst that Canada can do. If Canada can cut off diplomatic relations with India, well, so be it. India will do the same. But India can take this many steps further. India can do a blanket withdrawal of all person of Indian origin cards issued to Canadian citizens of Indian origin, which will not make Justin Trudeau very popular, even among his Khalistani vote bank. And India can do much more. Canada will be essentially isolated. Various Western nations may, give lip service support to Canada, but Canada will essentially find no takers for these stunts it is pulling. And it's not Canada, it's Trudeau who's behind this. I don't blame Canada for this. I don't blame the people of Canada, the nation of Canada. I blame Justin Trudeau for this. So I would, I would tell the people of Canada, you deserve better than this. You deserve better than Trudeau. He has dragged your country down into the dumps. You have a jobs crisis, you have a housing crisis, you have higher and higher inflation, your foreign policy is taking you nowhere, you are antagonizing one of the largest, most powerful nations in the world, and a nation that is not your enemy. I don't know what Trudeau is trying to do. Who is Trudeau fighting for? As the Prime Minister of Canada, he is supposed to fight for the nation of Canada and for the people of Canada. He is supposed to prioritize Canada's national interest, long-term national interest and security. And he's not doing that. He is fighting. He's fighting for terrorists. He's fighting for people who are gangsters and criminals and terrorists and enemies of a friendly nation. That's essentially going to be Trudeau's legacy. The Trudeau experiment has failed. When's your next general election? 25, 26? Please vote him out. Get someone better. All right. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Thank you.